My dad refused to hire a roofer and tried to fix it himself, so I turned my leaking office into an indoor campsite and billed him. There is a specific breed of stubbornness that only exists in fathers who watch too many weekend home improvement shows. My dad, Arthur, belongs to this category. He genuinely believes that paying a licensed professional for any repair is a personal insult to his intelligence. For years, I tolerated his disastrous plumbing experiments and wobbly deck construction to keep the peace. But when a severe spring storm exposed a massive hole in my roof, dumping gallons of rainwater directly onto my home office desk, my patience finally evaporated. I hired a reputable roofing company. My dad intercepted them, armed himself with a cheap bucket of asphalt tar, and declared the problem solved. When the rain returned and the leak worsened, he told me to just use a towel. That was when I decided to stop arguing and start charging. I went to the garage, pulled out my camping gear, and turned my ruined office into a luxury indoor campsite. To fully appreciate my dad's DIY delusions, you must understand his track record. Arthur is a retired physics teacher who approaches household maintenance with unyielding confidence. He refuses to call experts. In his mind, YouTube tutorials are the equivalent of a contracting degree. When my kitchen sink leaked 3 years ago, he insisted on fixing it himself. He used PVC pipes not rated for hot water, resulting in a melted joint and a flooded floor. When I built my back deck, he offered to stain it. He used an exterior fence sealant, turning my cedar planks a sticky neon orange. Despite these failures, his confidence never wavered. He viewed every professional quote as a scam and every contractor as a thief. I live in a modest ranch house 20 minutes outside the city. I work remotely as a data analyst, meaning my home office is the nerve center of my livelihood. The room features dual monitors and a custom walnut desk I spent months saving for. Directly above this desk is the only roof section the previous owners patched with hope and prayer. I planned to get it inspected, but the roof seemed fine during the dry summer months. The incident arrived on a gloomy Tuesday in late April. The forecast predicted a severe squall line, bringing high winds and heavy downpours. I spent the morning working from home, deeply focused on a financial report. Around noon, the sky darkened and the rain began. It hammered against the shingles with the force of a drumline. I felt a vibration in my desk. Then, I heard a distinct rhythmic plink. I pulled off my headphones and traced the sound to the white ceiling directly above my monitors. A dark wet spot was rapidly expanding across the white drywall. Before I could grab a towel, the drywall bubbled and gave way. A steady, aggressive stream of brown, debris-filled rainwater poured down, splashing directly onto the surface of my walnut desk and pooling around my keyboard. I scrambled to move my laptop and hard drives, my heart pounding as I watched my expensive workspace turn into a muddy swamp. I immediately grabbed my phone and called a highly rated local roofing company. A dispatcher told me they had a crew finishing a job 3 streets over and could send someone within the hour to tarp the roof and assess the damage. I hung up, feeling a wave of relief, and started mopping up the water. 20 minutes later, my dad's rusted pickup truck pulled into my driveway. He didn't knock, he just walked in through the unlocked back door, carrying a massive, dripping wet canvas tarp and a plastic bucket of black roofing tar. He took one look at the puddles on my floor and the water still dripping from the ceiling and sighed heavily. "I saw the roofer's truck down the street," he said, shaking his head in profound disappointment. "You're not actually paying those guys to fix a simple shingle tear, are you? They quoted you $800 just to look at it. It's absolute highway robbery." "Dad, the drywall is compromised and water is pouring into my office," I said, wringing out a mop into a bucket. "I need a professional to tarp it and fix the underlying structure." "I already called them. They're scammers," he declared, marching past me toward the hallway closet. He pulled out my extension ladder and a rusty putty knife. "It's a missing shingle. I can patch it with tar and a piece of flashing in 20 minutes. Total cost, $12. You're not spending $800 on a fancy uniform to spread some goop," I tried to argue. I explained that the water was coming through the decking, which meant there was likely rot. I told him that if he went up there in this wind, he was going to break his neck. He waved off my concerns with a dismissive flick of his wrist, grabbed the bucket of tar, and marched out the back door. I stood by the window, watching in helpless frustration as he wobbled up the aluminum ladder in his slip-on loafers. He spent about 15 minutes on the roof, slapping thick, messy globs of black tar onto the shingles. He climbed down, wiped his hands on his jeans, and gave me a triumphant smirk. "Good as new," he said, washing his hands in the kitchen sink. "You can tell that crew to turn around. I saved you a fortune." I didn't have the energy to fight him anymore. I just nodded, went back to my office, and tried to salvage my paperwork. The dripping stopped. I assumed he had actually managed to cover the hole. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning up the mud and drying out my desk. The next morning, the weather report announced a second wave of heavy rain. I woke up early, made a pot of coffee, and walked into my office to start my day. The moment I opened the door, My stomach dropped. The tar patch had completely failed. In fact, it had made things worse. The heavy tar had trapped the moisture against the rotted wood, accelerating the decay. The stream of water was now twice as wide, pouring down in a relentless, muddy cascade. It had soaked into the carpet, ruined my area rug, and was inches away from my computer tower. My phone vibrated against the desk. It was a text from my dad. Saw the rain. Don't worry, the tar just needs a few more hours to cure. Just put a bucket under it. It'll stop by noon. I stared at the glowing screen, a cold, hard clarity washing over me. He wasn't going to call the professionals. He wasn't going to admit he was wrong. He was going to let my house rot because his pride was worth more than my property value. Arguing with him was useless. Begging him was useless. If I wanted this fixed, I had to speak his language. I had to make the cost of his stubbornness so visible, so undeniable, that he would have no choice but to write a check. I turned around, walked down the long hall to the garage, and began loading up my heavy camping gear. I hauled the heavy canvas duffel bag from the garage, the wheels protesting loudly against the hardwood floor. Inside was my 4-person dome tent, a relic from a scouting trip a decade ago. I dragged it into the office, right into the center of the room, positioning the peak of the nylon roof directly beneath the worst part of the ceiling leak. I unzipped the mesh door and crawled inside, laying down 2 thick foam sleeping pads and unzipping my Sub-Zero sleeping bag. To complete the aesthetic, I dragged in my battery-powered camp lantern, a small folding camp chair, and my insulated cooler. I placed the lantern on the floor, casting a warm, flickering glow against the bright orange nylon walls. It looked like a high-end glamping setup if the campsite happened to be located inside a failing residential structure. Next, I needed to establish the business end of the operation. I sat cross-legged on the sleeping pad and opened my laptop, balancing it on my knees. I opened a blank document and began to type. I used the same clean, minimalist font I used for my actual freelance invoices. At the top, I created a fictional LLC, Indoor Water Feature Campsite and Resort. I itemized the charges meticulously. Line item 1, premium tent site rental, billed at a nightly rate of $150, justified by the exclusive, uninterrupted acoustic experience of falling water. Line item 2, hazard pay and equipment risk surcharge, set at $200, to cover the depreciation of my electronics due to the ambient humidity. Line item 3, lost productivity and ergonomic discomfort fee, calculated at my standard hourly consulting rate for the 6 hours I would be forced to work in a compromised environment. The subtotal was climbing rapidly. I added a standard 20% gratuity, labeled mandatory resort fee, and formatted the final total in bold size 14 font. I printed 2 copies on heavy cardstock. Finally, I took a piece of poster board and a thick black marker. I drew a rustic hand-painted sign that read, "Welcome to the Leaky Roof Campground. Please keep quiet and enjoy the natural water feature." I taped the sign to the outside of the tent flap. With the administration complete, I settled in to work. I propped my laptop against a pillow and connected to my phone's hotspot. The sensory experience was entirely unique. Every time the wind howled outside, the tent fabric rippled, and a fresh splash of brown water hit the nylon roof with a loud, resonant smack. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, like being trapped inside a drum during a rainstorm. The air inside the tent grew rapidly humid, smelling of wet carpet, old canvas, and the sharp, metallic tang of the roofing tar my dad had so generously applied. My knees ached against the thin foam pad, and the dampness was making my hair frizz, but the sheer petty satisfaction of the moment kept me warm. I spent the next 3 hours answering emails and reviewing spreadsheets, my fingers flying across the keyboard while a steady rhythm of dripping water provided a chaotic soundtrack. I was deeply immersed in a particularly complex data pivot table when I heard the front door unlock. My dad walked in, shaking the rain from his jacket. He was holding a plastic container of leftover lasagna, presumably acting the part of the concerned father bringing lunch to his hardworking child. He stopped dead in his tracks in the hallway, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of the office. I watched through the mesh window of the tent as his brain struggled to process the scene. In the center of the room, surrounded by soaked carpet and a steady stream of water cascading from the ceiling, sat a bright green dome tent. A camp lantern glowed from within. A hand-painted sign dangled from the rainfly. He dropped the lasagna container on the only dry spot on the desk, the plastic lid popping open and splashing marinara sauce onto a stack of unpaid bills. He didn't say a word. He just stared, his mouth slightly open, his eyes darting from the tent to the ceiling and back again. I unzipped the mesh door and crawled out, brushing a stray piece of lint off my jeans. I picked up the 2 printed invoices and walked over to him, holding them out like a waiter presenting the check at a fine dining establishment. He looked at me, then at the then back at the ceiling. He snatched the first paper from my hand, his eyes scanning the line items. His face turned a fascinating shade of plum. He looked at the second invoice. I explained that since he insisted on fixing the roof himself with a bucket of tar, he was now the sole proprietor of the campground, and he needed to sign the receipt. He stared at the total, his hands beginning to shake as he realized the exact dollar amount of his DIY failure. "This is ridiculous," Arthur finally sputtered, his voice echoing slightly in the damp, enclosed space of the office. He waved the heavy cardstock in the air, the paper trembling in his grip. "You cannot charge me for camping in your own house. I am your father. I do not pay for hazard pay when I am just trying to help my kid save a few bucks on a minor repair." I kept my posture relaxed, leaning against the doorframe, careful to stay out of the direct line of the ceiling drip. The smell of wet carpet and old canvas was strong, but the satisfaction of the moment kept me grounded. "I appreciate the sentiment, Dad, but this is not a camping trip. This is a commercial enterprise. You provided the hazardous conditions, and I am providing the accommodation. The rates are non-negotiable, and the mandatory resort fee is already included in the subtotal." He looked from the invoice to the tent, then up at the ceiling, where a fresh, heavy droplet of brown water was gathering at the edge of the compromised drywall. "I am not paying you $400 to sleep in a tent," he insisted, though his voice lacked its usual booming authority. "Just take the tent down. I will go buy a better tarp from the hardware store. A heavy-duty one." "No," I said simply. The word hung in the humid air, sharp and absolute. "You are not going to the hardware store. You are going to call the roofing company I originally hired, the one with the $800 quote." His jaw tightened. The stubborn set of his shoulders returned, a physical manifestation of a man who had never admitted defeat in 40 years of household maintenance. $800 to patch a shingle is a scam. I can buy a bundle of architectural asphalt for a fraction of that. I just need to let this first layer cure properly. As if on cue, the structural integrity of the ceiling above us finally gave up the ghost. The drywall, saturated far beyond its physical limit, let out a soft, tearing sound. A chunk of wet plaster the size of a dinner plate detached and plummeted downward. It missed my tent by mere inches, splashing violently into the shallow puddle at Arthur's feet, sending a spray of cold, dirty water directly up the legs of his denim jeans. He yelped, jumping backward and slipping slightly on the soaked carpet. He looked down at his ruined shoes, then up at the gaping hole in the ceiling, where the gray afternoon light was now visibly streaming through the exposed, rotted rafters. The reality of the situation had finally breached his fortress of denial. He was not saving money. He was actively destroying the house, and his pride was the only thing keeping him from admitting it. I pulled a pen from my pocket and tapped it against the invoice. "The rates go up after 5 p.m., Dad, and if the water hits the tent, I am adding a dry cleaning surcharge for the nylon." The fight drained out of him all at once. His shoulders slumped, and he let out a long, ragged sigh that sounded like a tire slowly losing air. He looked at me, his eyes finally reflecting the exhaustion of a man who had fought a losing battle against basic physics and gravity. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the screen. "What is the number for the roofers?" I recited the digits, and he dialed. I listened as he humbled himself on the phone, scheduling an emergency crew for the following morning. Then, with a heavy hand, he signed the bottom of the invoice, his pen tearing the paper slightly. He handed it back to me without making eye contact, turned around, and walked out of the house. The next morning, the professional crew arrived in a massive branded truck. They were efficient, polite, and entirely uninterested in my dad's DIY theories. They spent 3 hours on the roof, replacing the rotted decking, installing new underlayment, and seamlessly matching the shingles. While they worked, I sat on the front porch drinking coffee and enjoying the dry, quiet morning. Arthur sat next to me, staring out at the lawn in silence. When the foreman came down to hand me the final receipt and the warranty paperwork, he casually mentioned that the previous tar patch had actually trapped moisture and accelerated the rot, doubling their repair time. Arthur just nodded slowly, taking a deliberate sip of his coffee, his eyes fixed firmly on the grass. The aftermath of the Great Roof Incident became a permanent fixture in our family lore. At Sunday dinner a few weeks later, my mother served a beautiful roast, completely unaware of the tension she was about to ignite. When the conversation turned to home improvements, my older brother mentioned he was thinking about repainting his exterior trim. Arthur immediately opened his mouth to offer his expert advice, but I cleared my throat and slid a folded piece of paper across the dining table. It was a copy of the Indoor Water Feature Campsite invoice. My brother picked it up, reading the line items aloud. "Hazard pay? Mandatory resort fee?" He burst out laughing, nearly choking on his mashed potatoes. My mother looked at the paper, then at my dad, her eyebrows raised in profound amusement. Arthur's face turned a familiar shade of plum. He did not argue. He just reached over, took the paper from my brother, and folded it neatly into his shirt pocket. "The roof is holding up perfectly," he said quietly, taking a large bite of his roast. I smiled, passing him the gravy boat. I learned a valuable lesson that week. You cannot argue with a stubborn DIYer using logic, and you certainly cannot defeat them with anger. The only way to win is to let the universe and a little bit of creative accounting prove your point. My office is dry, my desk is safe, and my dad now strictly limits his home improvement projects to changing light bulbs. And honestly, the peace and quiet is worth every single penny.